and the anger erupting after 4 LAPD officers were acquitted after being charged with excessive force and brutality in the arrest of Rodney King in LA. In that time, by the way, I think there was about 63 people lost their lives in those riots. There were several thousand people who were arrested and several thousand people injured as well. Brian Bentley is a former LAPD officer. He's now an author. He was there, present in LA, working as a police officer as those riots unfolded. And Brian joins us from the United States of America on Talk Radio this morning and Talk TV. Brian, hi, how are you?
I'm doing great, and thank you for having me on your show.
Oh, real pleasure. Thank you for letting us continue a conversation we've kind of had on a theme tonight. We've been talking about a lot, and that is protest. Take us back to the beginning of your story, Brian, in the LA riots and joining the police. What took you into the police force in the first place?
Well, I wanted to make a difference. I wanted to bridge that gap between my community and law enforcement, and I was very naive at the time, and I thought that I could really go in and just be a mediator between the community and law enforcement, because at that time, law enforcement and the citizens of Los Angeles were bumping heads, and there was a lot of conflict. And I thought that coming from Los Angeles, growing up in Los Angeles, that I could do a good job and bridge that gap between the community and law enforcement.
And so, pretty kind of noble ambitions right there, Brian. What police force did you find when you joined the LAPD?
Well, I joined the Los Angeles Police Department, and, immediately I learned that it was going to be a difficult task and almost impossible. I quickly gave up hope. I became, my idealistic views changed. And shortly after coming on the police department, I was there for the 1992 riots.
And so you said that your idealistic views changed?
Yes, they did. They did. I always had a positive view of police officers. I've never had prior to being a police officer, I never had any negative interaction with police officers. I never disliked any police officers. It wasn't until I actually became a police officer that I started not to like my partners. And, I found that they didn't have the same views and the same goals that I had. Coming from the community, I really wanted to be, a good community-based police officer patrolling the neighborhood that I grew up in. And I found that a lot of the officers were from other states, and they had heard about the reputation of South LA, and they were only there for the action, the chases, the thrill of the hunt. And, that was kind of discouraging for me.
The thrill of the hunt?
Yes. Chasing gang members, cars, chases, foot pursuits, that type of thing, the things that they saw on television, and they wanted to, relive that type of life.
Were you ever, Brian, you can, feel free to be as honest as you can on this, if you don't mind me asking. Were you influenced by that culture?
Oh, definitely. I went from someone who was, I would talk to gang members and, try to convince them there's a better life, initially. And then, violence can be very habit forming. That adrenaline rush is very habit forming. And so, I woke up every day and, I went to work at night. I went to work every night looking for a pursuit, looking for a car chase, hoping someone would resist. And so, I went through that period too. And it was just, I went through a moment of reflection, and that's what I wrote my book about, was, reflecting back on how I quickly changed. And, some officers don't. And I kind of equate it to a light switch. If you switch a light switch off and on, over and over again, it's going to break. Either it's going to stay on or it's going to break. And a lot of officers are broken. They suffer from mental illness. They're addicted to the violence, and they never come back from it. Fortunately for me, I was able to reflect and, come back from that and change the way that I did my patrols.
Wow. What a metaphor. If you flick a light switch on and off, it's going to break, and a lot of them are broken. Blimey. Goodness me. Yeah. Before we get to the riots themselves, Brian, which is of course what we're marking this weekend, 30 years since the riots, can you take us to the catalyst for them? What did you make of, there was an incident that involved Rodney King. People who were around at the time will remember this because it was an enormous news story. It was hotly debated, wasn't it? The methods that were used by those 4 police officers who were accused of and charged with and eventually acquitted of using brute force, attacking Rodney King and brutalising him. What did you make of that incident?
Well, here's the thing. When the Rodney King beating took place, I was a rookie. It was my first year. And I was standing in the watch commander's office, and I saw the video of the beating, and it was horrible. I was horrified. I had never seen anything like that in my life. I had heard some friends talk when I was a teenager about getting beaten by the police, but I always thought maybe, I visioned it as the police grabbing them. I thought maybe they were overdoing it, what they were talking about, kind of adding something extra to it. And I had no idea what a police beating was. And so when I saw the Rodney King incident, it was just the worst thing I had ever seen. At that time, I was working in the west side of Los Angeles, which is a very prominent neighborhood, Bel Air, Brentwood, Palisades, very rich people. That's where I started as a rookie. Several months later, after the Rodney King beating, I transferred over to South Los Angeles, a division in South Los Angeles, which is a minority community. And on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the worst, the Rodney King beating was probably a 3 compared to what I saw once I transferred over into South Los Angeles. The Rodney King beating was like love taps. And so I saw a lot of brutality by police officers. And it just so happens that the Rodney King beating was at that time was captured on tape, and that was like the first time we had seen that on video. But it took place in the other side of town nightly. Police officers catch people after pursuits and beat them. It was kind of known that if you run from the police, you're going to get beat down. And so, it was a culture shock initially, but it just became part of the culture as I transferred.
And the acquittal came, and the riots were as a response to that. The uprising of protest was as a response to that, wasn't it, Brian? Can you remember 30 years ago, as we said this weekend, where you were when that began?
30 years ago, to me, it was like yesterday. I remember it like it was yesterday. I can't even believe it was 30 years ago because it's so fresh in my mind. When the riots first took place, when the verdict was announced, I had just started my vacation, and I was watching it on TV, eating popcorn, sitting back, watching the verdict, and I was just happy that I wasn't working, that I was on vacation. And then my phone rang, and my sergeant said, "You have to come to work. You have an hour to get to work." And I said, "Well, I'm on vacation." And he said, "Well, everybody, all police officers mandated have to come in, and you need to be here within an hour." So they took me off of my vacation. So as I was driving into my station, everything was on fire. Everything. I mean, the stores, trees, there were people in the street, people taking furniture, looting. It was like something from a movie. There was no police officers. It was lawless. People were looking into your car, and it was a terrifying experience. And I just drove down the main street, and everything was on fire. All the businesses were on fire. There were no police around, and people were doing whatever they wanted to do. And it was a terrifying moment. It was something I will never, ever forget. I can't forget the smoke, the smell of the smoke, the sights, people running down the street with couches, refrigerators. And it was just, it was something, it seems like it was yesterday, and I'll never forget it.
Mm. Can you remember as well then, Brian, what happened when you arrived at the police department and the response that you walked into?
Well, this is the very disheartening thing is the Los Angeles Police Department has always promoted themselves as being the best law enforcement agency in the whole entire world. And so once I got into the police station, they had called in all the officers, and we didn't have enough equipment. We didn't have enough shotguns. We didn't have enough radios. We didn't have enough cars. So we were just at the station, just sitting there waiting for the resources. It was something that it was unprecedented, and we had never experienced it before, and we had no way of going out into the streets. And then we had the worst news possible, and that was they told us that all the jails were full, that we couldn't make any arrests because we had no place to put anybody. So basically, when we eventually got cars, we were sent out, and basically we were spectators to what was going on. And then later on, we responded to the fire department calls because they were being shot at, rocks and bottles were being thrown at them. So most of the first night, we followed the fire department and supported them, protect them as they tried to put out fires. And people were shooting at us. People were throwing bottles, rocks. It was just very chaotic, and it was just very disheartening because people were right in our face, and we couldn't arrest them because we had nowhere to put them at the time.
Gosh, wow, blimey. It sounds like absolute chaos, doesn't it? Absolute chaos.
It was chaos.
You felt, I guess, in that moment like you couldn't do your job, Brian, even if you wanted to.
Well, it wasn't like I felt like it. I was
you literally
given
were
an
told
order.
not to.
I was told not to. I was told not to do anything, and you just couldn't. We tried to scare off looters by getting out of the car, going into the buildings and getting them to scatter, but we couldn't arrest anybody, and we were just hoping they knew that. And so, and it was very disheartening for me because I patrolled in the area where I lived. So all the stores that were burning and looting were the stores that I shopped at, the banks that I did my business. And so it was a personal experience. And then when I was off, when I finally got some time off, well, we worked like 19 hours the first day. When I went home, I could smell smoke. I could see the fires. It was like I was still there.
Oh, extraordinary. It must have been really, really difficult for you to process that. As you say, your community and a place that you knew not just as a police officer, but that you knew as a person as well, and somebody who had an affinity and a relationship with that community and that part of the world. You're hearing tonight from Brian Bentley. He is a former LAPD police officer, and did that. I mean, in the days after that, Brian, then as the sort of attempts to kind of heal the process, the relationship between the community and the police played out. What kind of role did you play?
Well, here's the interesting thing: is that after the riots, after the looting, people's opinion turned. So people, you had all the stores that were looted, and a lot of the citizens were angry. Politicians were angry. And so we, as police officers, had the green light to go out and, make sure that we restored order and to lower the crime rate. So basically, we were just given the green light to do whatever we needed to do. So people often talk about, the riots, and it was an uprising, but police brutality was worse after the riots. The arrests became higher after the riots because people were fed up at what some of the looters were doing and what the criminals were doing. So it kind of changed focus. Police officers went out there and they made more arrests, and they were more aggressive and actually more violent after the riots. And for the patrol officers, there was no one trying to get any peace. It was trying to get revenge and restore honor, because LAPD really looked bad after the riots. We looked horrible, and they were trying to save face after the riots. And so some of the the efforts to restore peace was not done from patrol officers. It was done from the upper part, the captains and the community relations, that part. But the field officers, the people on the street, the officers that were on the street, they were just trying to save face and trying to get respect, because we lost our respect, and criminals were not respecting us because they thought they could do whatever they wanted to do. So we had to show them that they were wrong.
Take us to the modern day then, Brian. And it's you know, the community's relationship with the police is a really, really hot topic that remains really high in the agenda, at the United States. It's really easy, Brian, to look at this now and think, well, the story that you're telling here resonates with events that are unfolding as we speak. I mean, literally in the last couple of days, there have been protests after more accusations of police brutality in the United States, and issues around stop and search, and a really high-profile case in which a black man was stopped by a police officer and was shot after attempting to grab his taser. It feels, Brian, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that I don't know. I mean, maybe it's too much to say, but little or no progress has been made on this issue. Would that be too much to say?
No, that's actually accurate. The thing is that you have a lot of great police officers. I worked with a lot of good partners, those who had good intentions, who really wanted to make a change, who had the same focus as I did. However, what you see on the street every day, you see crime, you see murders, just brutality, all kind of violence, and what that does is it messes with officers mentally. A lot of officers are mentally ill. You know, they have some form of mental illness, and they're addicted to the violence, and they can't help it. Just like Derek Chauvin. I mean, there was people with cell phones. You have police officers with body cams. You have security cameras. Everybody is watching. And these officers still go out and complete and do, police brutality, even though everybody's watching. And it's because they can't help it. You know, they're so disturbed and so broken that they cannot help it. And you have some sick officers that, regardless of what type of policies you put in place, they're going to break them because they can't control it. And, that's one of the things that I always talk about is that, they talk about police training. You don't need training. Police officers need some type of outlet. They need some type of mental health issues, to deal with their mental health issues, because these cops can't help it. I mean, we already have the laws. Police officers already know that if they get caught for police brutality, if they get arrested, they're going to go to prison. They're going to be in prison. They may get raped in prison. But they still do it because they can't control it. Mm.
So, one last question. What do you then think needs to change?
I think that the change has to be something that's in place with all departments throughout the United States, and it has to deal with some type of mental health training or outlet, or cops need to learn how to deal with their emotions. Because it's not just things that are on the job. When I was a police officer, I was always angry, and I didn't even know why I was angry, but I was angry. And police officers need to learn why they're angry and how to deal with that. A lot of police officers that I know that I worked with were alcoholics. They would go home and just drink themselves, to sleep every night. And it's because they couldn't deal with the issues that they had, personal issues and issues on the job. And that's where it needs to be focused. That's the only way you're going to get change, is to address it as if it's a mental illness, because whatever policies you put in place, they're going to break them.
Well, Brian, an incredible insight you've offered tonight. Really, really incredible. You've written a couple of books about this, haven't you? What would just remind me the name of your books?
My first book, and the best book I have, is called One Time, The Story of a South Central Los Angeles Police Officer. My second book is called Honor Without Integrity. And my third book is called Hit Me Once, Hit Me Twice, and that's about domestic violence.
Right. Brilliant to talk to you tonight, Brian. Really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much for your time. It's been so insightful. Brian Bentley, former LAPD officer who was present at the LA riots, 30 years this weekend. Astonishing insight. And also, one of the things that I think that we want to do a lot of on this show, if I may say so, is get to the root cause of the things we're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely.